Did you know that after a rock slide or a volcanic eruption, we have to create soil before other life can grow? Lichens play an important role in this process. Hi, today's lesson is on primary succession. So we're going to look at how landscapes started. So ecosystems exist in a state of equilibrium, which is like homeostasis. Now this is a stable state where all the biotic and abiotic components are in balance, and they all play a role in supporting the communities that live in the ecosystem. These ecosystems developed through the process of succession, which is a process changing in clearly punctuated stages. So primary succession is the development of an ecosystem from an area of bare rock, and there may or may not be a few species there. Typically, primary succession results from volcanic eruptions where new land is formed or old land is covered up with new rocks. Erosion, where all the landscape has been removed and only rock is left. Glaciation, because after that ice retreats, rock is left behind. And rock slides, where rock has fallen down from above and covered up all the existing components of an ecosystem. So when we look at the pictures on the right, we want to explain why each of the geographic situations results from primary succession. So the volcanic eruption flows all over the existing terrain, concealing it, and then it forms hard, solid volcanic rock. Now, volcanic rock can also be formed, forming new land. So if it comes up under the ocean, a new island can be formed where there maybe wasn't any existing terrain. Now, erosion is when sediment and inorganic materials are removed from one ecosystem and deposited in another. So there won't be any life left behind or where it was deposited. For glaciation, now these heavy moving glaciers scrape all plant life and solid bedrock and solids and topsoil from the bedrock as they move, and they deposit those rocks and minerals in new locations. So the ice has been covering an area for a long period of time, so there is no ecosystem underneath it. And then with a rock slide, that rock is removed from one location on a mountain and deposited further down, and that the force of that falling rock often removes existing plant life and terrain and the organic material, and it buries it in the rock area. Now, occasionally in rock slides, we can see that there will be, like some say, spruce trees that will grow up in between the rocks, and those are ones that kind of like survived the tumble down. But because there's no soil, there's really no other plants or animals that live there. So in an ecosystem, during the process of succession, we have something known as a pioneer species. Now, since the land is uninhabited and has little to no nutrients, primary succession requires simple, hardy organisms that can inhabit the barren ground. And these organisms are called the pioneer species. So they pave the way for future life by changing the original habitat, one basically of barren rock, into one that can sustain more diversity. And typically this includes ferns, lichens, mosses, and bacteria, and they're slowly going to break that rock down into soil and nutrient components. So since the land is uninhabited and has really no nutrients, primary succession requires very hardy organisms. And these organisms have tiny roots, and they physically will break apart the rocks, causing it to crumble away. Bacteria and lichen are going to produce acid, which chemically breaks down the rocks. And through both these processes, larger solid rocks are broken down into inorganic soil. So once there's a nutrient-rich humus soil, grasses can begin to grow. And the grass roots grow into the soil and bedrock and create larger cracks, further breaking away the rocks, producing more soil. And that happens in this stage here. As the vegetation grows taller, it produces shade, and the pioneer species, who are typically sun-loving, begin to die off. And now the grass has succeeded the original pioneer species of lichens and mosses. So the shorter grasses are succeeded by taller grasses, which then are followed by broad-leafed shrubs. And they're followed by deciduous trees. And typically the climax community, especially in Alberta, is coniferous trees with some mixed deciduous trees in there as well. Now, the final stage of succession is known as the climax community, and this is when the community is its most stable and it has resulted from the process of succession. So, a climax community is composed of species best adapted to the conditions in that area, and they're able to compete for their place in that ecosystem. So, climax communities are an ideal state of equilibrium in an ecosystem because we don't see a lot of change. However, climax communities don't often have the greatest biodiversity in an ecosystem. So in Alberta, the boreal forest is the climax community, and this is a mix of deciduous trees to drop leaves and return nutrients to the soil, and coniferous trees that provide shade, shelter, enough cover for carnivores to hunt, and they provide that year round. And biological diversity is the key to a sustainable climax community. So we need to have herbivores, carnivores, decomposers, and producers to have a sustainable climax community. Now, when I say a climax community isn't always the most biodiverse, often we'll see in those shorter shrub forests with more deciduous trees a greater variety of species, because you can have species that live on the edge and species that live in the middle, where the boreal forest is a quite uniform ecosystem. So succession happens in water habitats as well. The starting point is the same. So an area of inorganic matter is converted into a thriving community because pioneer species are able to turn a nutrient poor landscape into a nutrient rich landscape that's needed for the ecosystem. Now, in a terrestrial ecosystem, the pioneer species are lichens, bacteria, ferns, and mosses to break down the rock and decompose it to make a humus rich soil. But in an aquatic ecosystem, the primary pioneer species is algae because they are photosynthetic. Now, they're able to take in inorganic matter from sun, carbon dioxide, and water to create those inorganic nutrients that consumers need. When they die, they sink to the bottom of the water basin, and as they decompose, they create a rich soil for water plants to start to grow in. So here we can see an aquatic ecosystem where we have a deep freshwater basin with no plants because of lack of light and deep water. Now, the only microorganisms in this ecosystem are phytoplankton. And as sediments get carried into the pond, this allows rooted plants to submerge, to start to grow, and then they begin to float to the top. And as those sediments continue to build up, reeds and grasses are able to develop around the edge of the marsh where they can be both rooted and reach above the top of the water. Now that marsh community is going to build up around the pond margins with shorebirds, frogs, other insects, and slowly reeds are going to take more of the pond as more silt builds up. So as they get shallower, they're able to grow more into the pond ecosystem. And then as the soil around the edge turn dry from waterlogged to damp, so now it's not soaking wet, trees such as willow and alder are able to become established. And so this is going to be the process of succession in an aquatic ecosystem. So first we're going to have algae, and then floating plants, followed by reeds and grasses along the edge, and then finally we'll have shrubs around the edge like willow and alder trees. So that's our look at how ecosystems move from bare rock to complex climax communities. I hope you enjoyed our lesson today. Take care.